All right, let's go. Number 10. Urban sniper nests. On August 23, 1942, the German Sixth Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus crossed into Stalingrad and expected to take the city within days. What followed instead was 5 months of the most savage urban combat in recorded history. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov made a decision that would redefine street fighting forever, stop retreating, and turn every ruin into a killing ground. Before Stalingrad, conventional military doctrine assumed that a retreating army conceded terrain and preserved its forces. Chuikov reversed that logic entirely. His 62nd Army was ordered to hold positions so close to the German front line that Stuka dive bombers could not attack Soviet positions without killing German soldiers. The rubble of a destroyed city, it turned out, was the perfect fortress. Individual Soviet marksmen were given pre-designated firing positions, resupply routes, and specific kill zones. Vasily Zaitsev, credited with more than 225 confirmed kills during the battle, became a Soviet propaganda symbol, but he was one of hundreds operating the same systematic, methodical approach. The Germans called what was happening to them Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats, and the name captured something real: the relentless, grinding, calculated nature of an enemy who had turned devastation itself into a weapon. The tactic worked not just by killing men, but by destroying their sense of safety at a fundamental level. A German soldier moving through Stalingrad could not know whether any shadow concealed a sniper. Forward movement became catastrophic. The Sixth Army's advance slowed from kilometers per day to meters per week, and the psychological cost compounded with every casualty. The Battle of Stalingrad ended on February 2, 1943, with 91,000 German survivors marching into Soviet captivity from an army that had numbered 300,000. The urban sniper doctrine born in those ruins now appears in the field manuals of every major military on Earth, a permanent inheritance from the most lethal city ever fought over. Number 9. Infiltration raids. When United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, they expected Japanese resistance to come at them directly. What they did not expect was to begin losing men at night, quietly, to an enemy who was already inside their perimeter before anyone knew a raid had begun. The infiltration tactic that terrorized Allied forces across the Pacific was not improvised. It was doctrine. Japanese infantry training drew on decades of emphasis on night movement, silence, and close-quarters killing. Soldiers trained extensively to move through dense terrain without sound, to locate sentries by breath and body heat, and to breach defensive lines not by overwhelming force, but by invisible patience. The objective was rarely to hold ground. The objective was to make the perimeter itself feel unsafe. The psychological effect was, by any measure, devastating. Allied soldiers on Guadalcanal, Tarawa in November 1943, and Peleliu in September 1944 reported that the raids did something conventional. Combat could not. They made sleep dangerous. A man who fears closing his eyes cannot recover, cannot think clearly, cannot function as a soldier. Rest became a casualty of the tactic as surely as any man who died in those silent, harrowing hours before dawn. Allied commanders responded with layered defensive systems, overlapping fields of fire, and tripwire warning systems, adaptations that reshaped infantry defensive doctrine across the entire Pacific theater. Brigadier Ord Wingate's British Chindits and the American 537th 7th Composite Unit, known as Merrill's Marauders, eventually adopted modified infiltration principles for their own deep penetration raids into Japanese-held Burma in 1944. The legacy of Pacific infiltration warfare runs directly into post-war Special Forces doctrine. The principle that a small, silent, deliberate force can paralyze a larger one by attacking not its body, but its certainty became a cornerstone of asymmetric military thinking that has never lost its relevance. Number 8. Armored Spearhead. On May 10, 1940, German armored columns crossed into the Ardennes forest, terrain that Allied commanders had formally assessed as impassable for tank formations. The assessment was catastrophically wrong. Within 6 weeks, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg had fallen. The world had never seen warfare move at this speed, and the shock was not merely military. It was psychological, institutional, and civilizational. Allied commanders in 1940 were operating from a doctrine shaped by the First World War, in which defensive lines held, attrition decided outcomes, and territory was measured in yards of mud. General Maurice Gamelin positioned France's best mechanized forces at the northern end of the Allied line, anticipating a German advance through Belgium. It was exactly what the Germans wanted him to think. The actual blow, conceived by General Erich von Manstein and executed by General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, came through the Ardennes, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely. Blitzkrieg, as it came to be called, was not simply fast. It was a coordinated system in which tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and Stuka dive bombers functioned as a single overwhelming instrument, moving faster than Allied headquarters could process what was happening. By the time a response was ordered, the situation it was designed to address had already ceased to exist. The numbers were annihilating. Approximately 89,000 Allied soldiers were killed in the Western campaign, and 1.9 million were taken prisoner. German losses were roughly 27,000 killed, a ratio that stunned military analysts worldwide. The Dunkirk evacuation between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, rescued 338,226 Allied troops, but every piece of heavy equipment was left behind on the beaches. Every modern armored doctrine on Earth, from NATO's airland battle concept to Russia's deep battle theory, descends directly from those panzer columns. Blitzkrieg did not just win a campaign. It made static defense obsolete as a primary military philosophy, and no army has been permitted to forget it since. Number 7. Tunnel warfare. When American Marines stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, they expected fierce resistance. They had been told the island's 20,000 Japanese defenders would fight to the last man. What they had not been adequately prepared for was that those defenders had quite literally gone underground, and that the island itself had been engineered into a weapon. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months overseeing the construction of approximately 18 kilometers of tunnels running beneath Iwo Jima at depths of up to 30 meters, designed to withstand naval bombardment that had already proven it could flatten everything above the surface. Kuribayashi had also issued an explicit order forbidding the banzai charges that had decimated Japanese forces elsewhere in the Pacific. His men would not charge. They would wait, absorb, and kill from positions that seemed impossible to locate or destroy. The effect on the Marines was methodical and merciless. Pillboxes that appeared destroyed would reopen as Japanese soldiers moved through connecting tunnels. Positions that had been cleared at great cost would reactivate hours later. The island offered no safe ground, no secure rear area, no moment in which a Marine could stop calculating the angle from which the next shot might come. The battle lasted 36 days. Of the approximately 20,000 Japanese defenders, 216 survived. Of the American attackers, 6,821 were killed and 19,217 wounded. Marines used portable M22 flamethrowers and tank-mounted flamethrowers fitted to M4A3 Shermans to seal tunnel entrances and burn out interconnected positions, a brutal process that became standard doctrine for the invasion of the Japanese home islands that was being planned in parallel. The tunnel system forced a complete reassessment of how fortified positions should be approached. The influence of Iwo Jima's tunnel network extended far beyond 1945. North Korean forces constructed elaborate underground systems before the Korean War, and Viet Cong tunnel complexes in Vietnam drew directly on the same strategic logic. When an army disappears underground and turns geology into armor, the question of how to fight it has never found a comfortable answer. Number 6. Banzai charges. Shortly before dawn on July 7, 1944, on the island of Saipan in the Mariana Islands, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito sent his final order to the remnants of the Japanese garrison. Then, he took his own life. What followed was the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War, approximately 4,300 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, some carrying only bamboo spears, advancing directly into the American line in a single coordinated wave that lasted through the night. The charge struck the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, with a force that overwhelmed 2 companies entirely. By morning, 406 Americans were dead and more than 500 wounded. Sergeant Thomas Baker and Private First Class Harold Agerholm were both awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions during those hours. Baker for continuing to fight while mortally wounded. Agerholm for evacuating casualties under sustained fire. The decorations reflected the scale of what the charge had inflicted on units that had not broken. The banzai charge is often mischaracterized as fanaticism without strategic purpose. That misreading misses the point. The 1941 military code, Senjin-kun, explicitly prohibited surrender and defined death in battle as the only honorable conclusion to combat. The charge was not irrationality. It was the weaponization of death itself, a calculated attempt to destroy the enemy's will to continue, by demonstrating that the Japanese soldier could not be deterred by the prospect of his own annihilation. It failed militarily on Saipan. The American line absorbed the assault and held. But the failure was, in its own way, the most consequential thing about it. Military planners reviewing the Saipan battle in 1944 concluded that an invasion of the Japanese home islands against defenders operating under the same code would cost between 250,000 and 1,000 Allied casualties. That calculation did not stay on paper. The banzai charge did not win Saipan, and it did not change the outcome of the Pacific War by force. It changed it by informing a decision made in Washington in the summer of 1945 about what the alternative to invasion would need to be. Number 5. Unrestricted submarine warfare. On September 3, 1939, the same day Britain declared war on Germany, the German submarine U-30 torpedoed the British passenger liner SS Athenia in the North Atlantic without warning, killing 117 civilians. It was, German Naval Command initially insisted, a mistake. Within months, it became policy. Admiral Karl Donitz's orders to his U-boat fleet were unambiguous. Sink Allied shipping. No warnings. No survivor assistance. No exceptions. International maritime law in 1939, codified in the 1936 London Naval Treaty, required submarines to warn merchant vessels before attacking and to ensure the safety of their crews. The rules were built on a recognition that the sea offered no refuge, that a man in the water had no options, and that the laws of war were supposed to preserve some minimum of humanity, even in the most brutal of environments. Dönitz determined that compliance was operationally suicidal for submarines, and he was not wrong. He simply chose to solve the problem by discarding the law. The consequences were cascading and catastrophic. Over the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, which ran from September 1939 to May 8, 1945, U-boats sank approximately 2,079 confirmed Allied vessels. The Laconia incident of September 12, 1942, in which U-156 sank a British troopship carrying 809 Italian prisoners of war and then attempted rescue operations, became a turning point. When Allied aircraft attacked the surface submarine during the rescue, Dönitz issued what became known as the Laconia Order, forbidding U-boat crews from assisting survivors under any circumstances. The order made mercy a court-martial offense. The attrition across the Atlantic was devastating on both sides. Approximately 72,000 Allied sailors and merchant mariners were killed. The U-boat service itself suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of any military in the war. Roughly 30,000 of 40,000 crewmen were killed, a mortality rate of 75%. Dönitz was convicted at Nuremberg, in part because of the Laconia Order, and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, drafted in direct response to the conduct of the war, explicitly addressed the rights of shipwrecked mariners for the first time with real binding force. The legal framework that now governs naval warfare was written around the reality that one of the war's most effective tactics had been the systematic decision to let men drown, and that the world required a treaty to say, plainly and permanently, that this was not permitted. Number 4. Scorched Earth. On November 17, 1941, as temperatures across the Soviet Union plunged and German Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, Joseph Stalin signed Order Number 428. It directed Soviet forces and partisan units to destroy every village, every structure, and every source of warmth and shelter within reach of the advancing German army. The Soviet people would freeze the Wehrmacht. The order did not specify who else might freeze alongside it. Scorched earth as a military concept was not new in 1941. The 1907 Hague Regulations, specifically Article 23G, already prohibited the destruction of enemy property unless militarily necessary. What distinguished the Soviet application and the German replication of it during their own retreat was the systematic, industrial scale and the deliberate indifference to civilian survival. Villages were burned not as a side effect of combat, but as the primary objective of organized military operations. The civilian cost was annihilating. The siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941 and lasted until January 1944, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 800,000 civilians, the majority from starvation and cold, caused directly by the destruction of supply infrastructure. Germany applied the same logic in reverse during its retreat from the Soviet Union, and on March 19, 1945, Hitler signed the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all German industrial infrastructure to deny it to the advancing Allies. Albert Speer spent the final weeks of the war systematically countermanding the order. The tactic forced a confrontation with a question that military law had never adequately answered. At what point does the destruction of civilian infrastructure, justified as military necessity, become an act of war against the civilian population itself? The Nuremberg tribunals examined this question at length, and the answers they reached were built into international law. The 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions includes a specific prohibition on attacking objects indispensable to civilian survival, including food, water, and shelter. That provision exists because scorched earth demonstrated, on both the Eastern Front and across occupied Europe, that without it, states at war would burn everything. The legal prohibition on starving civilians as a method of warfare did not come from philosophical principle. It came from the documented evidence of what happened when there was no prohibition at all. Number 3. Kamikaze attacks. At approximately 10:51 on the morning of October 25, 1944, a Japanese Zero dive bomber flew directly into the flight deck of the American escort carrier USS St. Lo off the coast of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. The bomb detonated inside the hangar deck. The ship sank in 30 minutes. It was the first deliberate suicide attack in the history of military aviation, and it had been planned that way from the beginning. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi established the Special Attack Units, known in Japanese as Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, on October 19, 1944, 6 days before the St. Lo went down. The strategic logic was direct and, in its own terms, coherent. Japanese aviation had been devastated at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where American fighter pilots and anti-aircraft crews had destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft with minimal losses. A conventional Japanese pilot attempting a bomb run against an American carrier had a very low probability of success. A pilot who became the weapon itself had a significantly higher one. The program killed approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots over the course of the Pacific War. In return, it sank approximately 47 Allied vessels and damaged around 300 more. On May 11, 1945, two kamikazes struck the carrier USS Bunker Hill within 30 seconds of each other, killing 346 men and wounding 264. At Okinawa, between April and June 1945, Allied forces faced approximately 1,465 kamikaze sorties in the most concentrated application of the tactic in the entire war, and the casualties inflicted on the U.S. Navy were the heaviest it suffered in any single campaign. What the kamikaze program introduced into the calculus of modern warfare was a logical problem for which conventional military doctrine had no prepared answer. Deterrence as a strategic concept depends on an adversary who values survival. A combatant who has already accepted and embraced death cannot be deterred. Rules of engagement designed to limit conflict and provide off-ramps had no mechanism for an enemy who had removed all off-ramps by design. Post-war international humanitarian law struggled to categorize the kamikaze pilot. He was a uniformed combatant, not a terrorist, operating under lawful orders from a recognized military command. Yet, the tactic he embodied sits at the origin point of every subsequent legal and strategic debate about suicide attacks, proportionality, and the limits of deterrence. 70 years of asymmetric warfare, from Beirut in 1983 to the present, has not resolved the problem that the kamikaze first posed. We have better language for it now. We do not have a better answer. Number 2. Area bombing. On the night of February 13, 1945, 796 RAF Lancaster bombers from Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris's Bomber Command flew over the German city of Dresden and dropped 1,478 tons of high explosives, followed by 1,182 tons of incendiary bombs. The firestorm that ignited reached temperatures estimated at 1,500 degrees Celsius. In basement shelters across the city, thousands of civilians who believed they were safe were asphyxiated as the fire consumed the oxygen around them. They were found the next morning seated upright, undamaged, dead. Area bombing as a strategic doctrine emerged from a specific operational reality. RAF Bomber Command in 1940 and 1941 discovered that precision daylight bombing was producing unacceptable aircrew casualties, and that navigational limitations made true precision at night virtually impossible. Harris concluded, with a logic that was militarily coherent and morally catastrophic, that if individual factories could not be reliably targeted, the solution was to destroy the cities that contained them entirely, along with the workers who ran them. Civilians were reclassified, in effect, as a legitimate military target class. The 1907 Hague Regulations had already established that undefended towns could not be attacked. The RAF's legal position rested on the argument that no German city was undefended, and that the destruction of industrial capacity and civilian morale constituted legitimate military objectives. By that reasoning, virtually any target in Germany qualified. Between 1940 and 1945, RAF Bomber Command dropped 1 million tons of bombs on Europe and lost 573 aircrew in the process. The USAAF's Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 civilians in a single night, making it the deadliest conventional air raid in history. Dresden's death toll, established by a Dresden Historical Commission investigation, completed in 2010, was approximately 22,700. The figure was far lower than wartime German propaganda claimed, and far higher than many post-war British accounts acknowledged. Harris was deliberately denied a campaign medal when the war ended, and Bomber Command received no official campaign medal until 2012. The British government's silence on the subject for more than 6 decades was itself a kind of admission. The 1977 Additional Protocol Wine to the Geneva Conventions, which explicitly prohibits indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations and requires proportionality assessments before any strike, exists as a direct legal response to area bombing. The question it encodes in international law, where precision ends and massacre begins, is one that Arthur Harris's Bomber Command answered in a way the post-war world determined it could not allow to stand. That legal architecture now governs every air campaign fought today, built on the rubble of cities whose civilian populations were burned to establish, by terrible example, that some answers were not acceptable. Number 1. Unit 731 and human experimentation. Sometime in 1938, in a secure compound built on a drained marsh outside the city of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a prisoner was strapped to an operating table. He was conscious. No anesthesia was administered. The surgeons who cut him open were officers of the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps, working under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, and what they were doing was science. They called their subjects maruta, the Japanese word for logs of wood. The log did not need to be made comfortable. The log needed to be observed. Unit 731 was not a battlefield improvisation. It was a formally constituted research program funded by the Japanese government, staffed by credentialed physicians, and operated under the direct sanction of Imperial Japanese Army headquarters. Between 1937 and 1945, the unit conducted experiments on an estimated 3,000 to 12,000 prisoners, the majority Chinese civilians, Korean laborers, Russian nationals, and Allied prisoners of war. Subjects were infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax to measure disease progression. They were frozen alive in sub-zero conditions to study frostbite. They were subjected to pressure experiments to determine at what point the human body would rupture. They were vivisected while conscious to observe organ function without the variables introduced by anesthesia. None of the subjects were expected to survive, and none of the experimental protocols required that they do. Unit 731's field operations extended beyond the laboratory. Biological weapons developed at Harbin were deployed against Chinese civilian populations throughout occupied China. Conservative estimates attribute between 200,000 and 580,000 Chinese civilian deaths to the biological warfare campaign that Unit 731 supplied and supported. Plague-infected fleas were released over Chinese cities. Water supplies were contaminated with cholera. The program industrialized disease as a weapon of annihilating systematic mass killing. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, General Douglas MacArthur's occupation authority in Tokyo made a decision. The data accumulated by Unit 731, the results of years of experiments that no ethical research program could legally or morally replicate, was considered too scientifically valuable to waste on prosecution. In 1947, American officials negotiated an immunity agreement with Ishii and his senior colleagues. The data was transferred to Fort Detrick, Maryland, the center of the American Biological Weapons Program. Ishii lived until 1959, never charged, never tried, dying of throat cancer in Tokyo. His deputy, Lieutenant General Masaji Kitano, became the head of a Japanese pharmaceutical company. The Soviet Union tried 12 Unit 731 members at the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in December 1949. The Western powers dismissed the proceedings as communist propaganda. The Nuremberg Code, the 10 foundational principles of ethical human experimentation, was written in 1947 in direct response to the Nazi medical experiments tried at Nuremberg. The 1964 Declaration of Helsinki, which now governs all medical research involving human subjects worldwide, extended those principles into binding international guidance. Both documents were written because of what men with medical degrees did in laboratories during the Second World War. Neither document mentions Harbin. The men who built the most systematic human experimentation program in the history of warfare were granted immunity by the country that wrote the rules, because the rules were less important than the results. Every subsequent international agreement on the ethics of human research every hospital ethics board, every informed consent form signed before a clinical trial exists in response to a crime whose perpetrators were never punished because the data was judged to be worth more than the justice. That is not a lesson the war was supposed to teach. It is the one it most durably delivered. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.